Welcome to today's audio lecture. This lecture will focus on persuasive messages and appeals. This lecture will be one of our longer, more ambitious lectures. We're going to be talking about 5 distinct topics. First, we'll talk about the essential elements of persuasive messages, elements that all persuasive messages must have. We'll then talk about the optional components of persuasive messages. Next, we'll look at some examples of persuasive messages, and then we'll talk about both classical principles of persuasion and more modern psychological principles of persuasion. These are tools and techniques that you can use to actually build an effective persuasive argument in your persuasive messages. But before we dive into these topics, let's first discuss what a persuasive message is. A persuasive message, like a routine message, focuses on motivating action. But whereas in a routine message, your reader typically has an inclination or an obligation to act, in the case of a persuasive message, your reader does not typically have an inclination or obligation to act. So if you find yourself writing a message in which you try to motivate action, but you know that your reader lacks either an inclination or an obligation to act, more than likely, you are writing a persuasive message. As these comments suggest, persuasive messages are defined by both their content and by their context. Therefore, one person's routine message becomes another person's persuasive message. If you're writing from a position of power or authority within a company or institution, and you want to provide your reader with a call to action, you can frame that call to action as a routine message. You don't need to persuade your reader to act. You can count on their location within a hierarchy or a chain of authority to motivate their action. But if you're not writing from that position of strength, then you do need to persuade your reader to act. You can't count on hierarchies or systems of authority to compel that action. Instead, you need to motivate that action persuasively. And that is why one person's routine message becomes another person's persuasive message based on both content and context. Okay, now that we've identified persuasive messages, let's dive into the essential elements of persuasive messages, the elements that all persuasive messages have, regardless of their length or content. The first thing that you need to know is that all persuasive messages share 4 basic elements. First, when writing a persuasive message, you must identify the problem or need that your proposal seeks to address. Critically, the problem or need that you identify in your persuasive message should not be your own. It should be the reader's. You want to focus on the reader's problem or need, not only because doing so will make your message more reader-focused, but also because persuasion works most effectively when you can show your reader how accepting your proposal, taking the action that you want your reader to take, aligns with your reader's self-interest. And that's why we begin by identifying the reader's problem or need and not our own problem or need. So to distill this idea into an annoying catchphrase, when beginning your persuasive message, lead with need. Whose need? Your reader's need, not your own. Once you've identified that problem or need, the reader's problem or need, you can then move on to the second major element of all persuasive messages. You must next propose a solution to the reader's problem or need that you previously introduced. Having proposed a solution to the reader's problem or need, you then, thirdly, must support that proposed solution with reason and evidence. That's the third essential element of all persuasive messages. And later in this audio lecture, we'll be talking more about the kinds of persuasive appeals you can use to most effectively support that proposed solution. And then finally, you must end your persuasive message with a call to action and with goodwill. Your call to action, not surprisingly, can take a variety of forms. It might involve implementing your proposal or solution in its entirety, or it might involve merely the first step towards implementing your proposal or solution. Maybe you want to meet and discuss your proposal further with your reader. Or maybe you want your reader to allocate $2,000 towards implementing the first stage of your solution. These are both viable calls to action. Your goodwill, meanwhile, should aim to make a good impression on your reader. Because, as we'll discuss at greater length when we're discussing the psychological principles of persuasion, people are more likely to accept a proposal when they like the person proposing it. Okay, so those were the 4 essential elements of persuasive messages. Regardless of the context, the content, or the length of your persuasive message, your message will contain all 4 of those elements. But now I want to move on to the optional elements, the optional structures for persuasive messages. The first thing that you need to know is that, as with other message types, you can take either a direct or an indirect approach to writing persuasive messages. You should take an indirect approach if your proposal is unsolicited, if your reader is unaware of the problem you seek to solve, or if your reader is reticent to address the problem that you seek to solve. What distinguishes an indirect persuasive message from a direct persuasive message is the amount of time that you spend establishing the reader's problem or need. Again, if this message is unexpected, unsolicited, or if your reader is unconvinced that they have a problem, you obviously need to spend more time convincing them of the problem that your proposal seeks to solve. You can take a direct approach to writing persuasive messages, on the other hand, if your proposal is solicited, if your reader acknowledges the problem you seek to address, or if your proposal will be easy to approve. If based on these criteria you decide that the direct approach is the appropriate approach for your persuasive message, then you can spend far less time establishing the reader's problem than you would in an indirect message, and move quickly instead to the solution. Now, some of you might be thinking that in direct approach persuasive messages, that identifying the reader's problem or need is fundamentally unnecessary. That if your reader has solicited your proposal, if they're aware of a problem and have asked you to propose a solution, that you don't need to repeat the problem. They're already aware of it. And I understand that line of thinking. But ultimately, even if your reader understands the problem, you should still begin your message by framing the problem you seek to solve. Because how you frame a problem informs how readers will perceive your solution. Framing is that powerful. Next, let's talk about your options when it comes to the length of your persuasive message. On this front, you've got 2 main choices. You can either write a shorter persuasive message, or you can write a longer persuasive message. If you're writing a short persuasive message, you want to focus primarily on those 4 essential elements that we discussed earlier. You want to begin by identifying your reader's problem or need. You then want to identify your solution to that problem or need. You want to state your proposal. You want to support that proposal with evidence, with reason. And finally, you want to conclude with a call to action and with goodwill. In lengthier messages, on the other hand, you're going to incorporate not just those 4 essential elements that we discussed earlier, but other elements as well. Elements like signposting, bold section heads, italicized subheads that help your reader quickly identify the purpose and content of sections at a glance. You want to include cohesion principles, things like mapping statements, paragraph heads, document feet, etc., etc., etc. Basically, you want to add in additional elements to make your document more scannable and easier for your reader to navigate. Now let's move on to some examples of persuasive messages. And let's start with an example of a short persuasive message. Take a look, for instance, at this short persuasive email. Because this is a short persuasive message, it really only contains those essential elements that we talked about earlier in the audio lecture. It begins with a statement that quickly identifies the reader's problem or need. That's the sentence in green. It then pivots to the proposal itself. That's the statement in blue. It supports that claim, that proposal, with reasons and evidence. That's the content in red. And then finally, it wraps up with a call to action in gold and a brief goodwill statement in violet. Now let's look at a longer persuasive message. As with our previous example, this longer message contains all 4 of those essential elements that are common to every persuasive message. In green, we've got content that identifies the reader's problem or need. And because this message appears to be unsolicited, it's taking a bit more of an indirect approach. It's spending more time identifying that problem or need. It then moves on to the proposal itself in blue. It supports that proposal in red. It concludes with the call to action in gold. And then finally, we have the goodwill statement, or statements in this case, in violet. But because this is a lengthier persuasive message, we also have some additional elements that help our readers more quickly and easily scan this document. Right under the blue text, for instance, we have a mapping statement that previews the structure of the document. In bold, we've got section heads that quickly identify the purpose of the body paragraphs. And then at the top of each of those body paragraphs, also underlined, we've got paragraph heads that link the purpose of each paragraph to the overall purpose of the document. Finally, at the very end of the document, also underlined, we've got a closing mapping statement that reiterates the structure and main points of the document so that the reader has a stronger sense going away from the document of what it was all about. Okay, now that we've discussed how to structure persuasive messages, let's discuss how you can actually make a persuasive argument. What kinds of strategies and techniques you can bring to bear on your message that will help convince your reader of your point of view. For the purposes of today's audio lecture, I've broken these strategies, these techniques, these principles into 2 broad groupings. The first of these is the classical principles of persuasion, which date back to the ancient Athenian philosopher Aristotle. According to Aristotle, there are 3 main principles of persuasion: logos or logic, pathos or emotion, and ethos or credibility. Of these principles, the most important is logos. Persuasive writing must appeal to logos. It may appeal to pathos and ethos. Now let's look at these principles in greater depth and think about how you can actually apply them in the context of a message, beginning with logos. You can appeal to logos in a number of different ways. Perhaps the most obvious is to do so by supporting your claims with sound reasoning and solid evidence. But while supporting your claims with sound reasoning and solid evidence is obviously fantastic, you want to make sure that you're avoiding two common pitfalls endemic to persuasive business writing. First of all, you want to make sure that you're putting all of your evidence in context. Persuasive business arguments are oftentimes very context specific. They're specific to the context of your company or your department. And if you don't contextualize your evidence, your claims will become either confusing or they'll become meaningless. You also want to avoid what we call death by numbers. In business settings, we tend to rely heavily on quantitative evidence. That's great. Quantitative evidence is very powerful. But if you overwhelm your readers with numbers, with data, your argument will become alienating and your reader will disengage with your writing. So avoid that. Avoid death by numbers. You can also appeal to logos not just by supporting your claims with reason and evidence, but also by anticipating and rebutting your readers' potential objections. Lastly, you can appeal to logos by striving to make your evidence as intelligible and memorable as possible. You can achieve this goal of making your evidence intelligible and memorable using three main techniques. First, you can humanize statistics. Second, you can prefer concrete information to abstract information. And finally, you can appeal to your reader's visual sense. These are all effective techniques for making your evidence as intelligible and memorable as possible. You can humanize statistics in a number of ways, but one of the best ways to do so is through comparisons. Ideally, comparisons that resonate with your readers' lived experiences. For an example of a comparison that resonates with readers' lived experiences, consider Stephen Covey's attempt to take a survey of employees' behaviors and motivations and translate it into terms that would more immediately resonate with readers. In a famous example of humanizing statistics, Stephen Covey reframed that polling information from the previous slide to more fully emphasize to readers just how dire the results of that poll actually were. And he accomplished this through a very clever and a very effective sports comparison. He looked at these results as if they were coming not from workers talking about their workplace, but instead as if they were coming from soccer players talking about the game of soccer. And by putting that information in a sports context, a context that many of us can relate to far more directly and in less abstract terms, we're able to comprehend the information in a far more direct and meaningful way than if we were to just read these polling statistics in their native form. We can also make our claims more intelligible and memorable by preferring concrete information to abstract information. Consider, for instance, this abstract claim. We need our new 727 to be the best passenger plane in the world. That claim is not very convincing because it relies upon the reader's understanding of abstract, open-ended terms like best. But if we instead specify what we mean by best, if we include concrete information and requirements, all of a sudden that claim becomes so much more memorable, intelligible, and frankly, convincing. Lastly, we can make our claims more memorable and intelligible by appealing to our readers' visual sense. If you need to support your claims with a lot of dense evidence, ask yourself what the best way to display that evidence is. Oftentimes, it is not a dense, data-laden paragraph like this one. Instead, a far more effective way to convey this same information is through charts or data visualizations like this. Okay, enough about logos or logic. Now let's talk about pathos or emotion. The first thing you need to know about pathos is that, at least in a business writing context, you should appeal to it sparingly. Pathos is like nutmeg. It's appealing in small doses, but it is poisonous in large doses. It will make your writing feel manipulative or smarmy. So keep your appeals to emotion to a bare minimum. If you do decide to appeal to pathos, you can do so by connecting to your readers' motives, needs, and fears. Or, to put it more plainly, you can simply write with empathy. You can think about who your reader is, what they want, what they need, what they care about, what they fear. And then you can produce a document that speaks to those wants and needs and cares and fears. It's just reader focus, which we've been talking about throughout this class, but with an emotional twist. You can also appeal to emotion, appeal to pathos, by emphasizing benefits over features, experiences over facts. Consider, for instance, a message in which you're trying to convince a reader to purchase a particular new computer. If you want to incorporate a pathos appeal into your message in addition to a logos appeal, you wouldn't just emphasize the bells and whistles, the features, as it were. You would also emphasize the benefits. You would emphasize the kinds of experiences that this computer will enable your reader to have. This is a great way to appeal to experience and emotion without feeling manipulative. Finally, let's talk about ethos appeals, or appeals to credibility. But while ethos appeals are essential to making convincing persuasive arguments, they're actually very difficult to incorporate into your writing. These ethos appeals are difficult to incorporate into your writing because if you start writing at great length about your qualifications and your experiences, your writing will come across as writer-focused and self-involved. And so the best way to appeal to ethos in writing is by simply crafting a good, well-argued, well-written document, and by developing your reputation with your audience, with your colleagues, off the page. If you write well and you have a good reputation in your wider professional circles, then you will effectively appeal to ethos in your persuasive message writing, even if you're not appealing directly to it. Okay, enough about the classical principles of persuasion. Let's bring this audio lecture into the modern era and close out by discussing the 6 psychological principles of persuasion associated with the American psychologist Robert Cialdini. And I'm going to discuss these 6 psychological principles of persuasion quite quickly because I've also assigned a really excellent video on these principles of persuasion that explains these principles far more effectively than I ever could. Still, in the interest of comprehensiveness, let's take a quick tour through these 6 principles. The first of these 6 principles is reciprocity, the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if you've first given them a gift or a favor. The second principle is consistency, the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if your proposal builds on their prior commitments. Next, we've got consensus, the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if your audience thinks your proposal is popular or widely supported. The fourth principle is liking, or the idea that you're more likely to persuade your reader if your reader likes you or thinks you like them, or even simply believes that the two of you have something in common. That's liking. Fifth, we have scarcity, the idea that you're more likely to persuade people if what you're proposing is unique or only briefly available. And lastly, we have authority, the notion that you're more likely to persuade people if they think you know what you're talking about, or if you can invoke the authority of someone who does know what they're talking about. And with that, friends, we are at the end of today's audio lecture. To summarize, all persuasive messages include the following 4 essential elements. They open by identifying the reader's problem or need. They propose a solution to that problem or need. They support that solution with reason and evidence, and they close with a call to action and goodwill. These persuasive messages can take a direct or indirect approach. You should take the direct approach when your reader has requested your persuasive message or is aware of the problem that your proposal seeks to solve. And you should use an indirect approach when your proposal is unsolicited or when your reader is unaware of the problem that you seek to solve. Your message can be long or short. If it's short, it should consist mainly of those 4 essential elements that we discussed previously. And if it's longer, it should also include signposting and cohesion principles to make the document more readable. Last but not least, you can support your claims using a mix of both classical and modern psychological principles of persuasion. Those classical principles include logos or logic, pathos or emotion, and ethos or credibility. And the psychological principles of persuasion include reciprocity, consistency, consensus, liking, scarcity, and authority. Thank you for listening.